The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training facility as Sarah Chun adjusted her rifle scope for the 100th time. Around her, the other recruits whispered among themselves, their voices carrying a mix of doubt and barely concealed mockery. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing barely 120 pounds, Sarah looked more like a college student than someone who belonged on a sniper training course. "You sure you can even lift that rifle?" Chin called out Marcus Rodriguez from across the firing line. The burly former Marine's comment drew snickers from several other trainees. Sarah ignored him, focusing instead on her breathing technique as Sergeant Williams had taught them. Sergeant Williams himself stood 20 yards behind the firing line, his weathered face showing no emotion as he watched his latest group of sniper candidates. In his 15 years of training military marksmen, he had seen every type of recruit imaginable. Some came with natural talent, others with pure determination, and a few with both. Sarah Chun was different, though. She had something he rarely saw, an almost supernatural calm under pressure. "Listen up, recruits," Williams barked, his voice cutting through the morning chatter. "Today we're testing your accuracy at 800 yards. Military standard requires hitting a target the size of a human torso at this distance. Miss 3 shots, and you're out of the program." Sarah felt her heart rate slow as she settled into position behind her rifle. The M24 sniper weapon system felt familiar in her hands now, after weeks of training. She had grown up hunting with her father in the mountains of Colorado, learning to read wind patterns and judge distances long before she ever considered military service. Those childhood skills had served her well in basic training, but this was different. This was about more than just hitting a target. This was about proving she belonged here. The first recruit up was Rodriguez. His shots were solid, grouping well within the acceptable range. The crowd of observers nodded approvingly as each bullet found its mark. Sarah watched carefully, noting how the wind shifted between shots and how the mirage patterns changed as the morning sun climbed higher. One by one, the other recruits took their turns. Most passed easily, their military backgrounds giving them the discipline and basic skills needed for this level of accuracy. A few struggled, their shots scattering wide of the target zone. Sarah noticed that those who failed had one thing in common. They let the pressure get to them, rushing their shots instead of taking the time to read the conditions properly. "Chin, you're up," Williams called out. Sarah moved to the firing line, aware of the sudden quiet that fell over the group. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her every movement as she settled into her shooting position. The familiar weight of the rifle against her shoulder was comforting, like greeting an old friend. Through her scope, the target looked impossibly small at 800 yards. The wind was picking up slightly, coming from her left at about 8 miles per hour. She made a mental calculation for the windage adjustment, her finger hovering over the scope's adjustment knob. "Take your time, Chun," Williams said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach her ears. "Remember your fundamentals." Sarah took a deep breath and let half of it out, feeling her heart rate settle into a steady rhythm. The crosshairs of her scope danced slightly over the target as she fought to control her breathing. In the distance, she could see the heat waves rising from the desert floor, creating the mirage effect that could throw off even experienced shooters. Her first shot rang out across the range. Through her scope, she saw the bullet impact just to the left of center, still well within the acceptable zone, but not quite where she had aimed. She heard a few murmurs from the watching crowd, whether approval or disappointment. She couldn't tell. "Good first shot," Williams noted, marking something on his clipboard. "Continue." Sarah made a slight adjustment to her scope and settled in for her second shot. This time she held her breath a fraction longer, waiting for the perfect moment when the crosshairs aligned exactly where she wanted them. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and she immediately saw the impact dead center of the target. "Excellent," Williams said, his voice betraying just a hint of approval. The third shot was where many recruits failed. The pressure of knowing they were almost finished, combined with the accumulated fatigue from holding a precise shooting position, often caused even good shooters to rush their final attempt. Sarah had seen it happen to 3 recruits already that morning. She took her time with the final shot, going through her entire routine from the beginning. Wind check, range estimation, breathing control, and sight alignment. When she was completely satisfied with her setup, she squeezed the trigger in one smooth motion. The bullet struck the target slightly high, but still well within the center ring. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she heard Williams call out, "Qualification complete. All shots acceptable." As she stood up from the firing line, Sarah caught the surprised looks on several faces. Rodriguez shook his head in what might have been admiration or disbelief. Other recruits, who had been openly skeptical now, seemed to be reassessing their opinion of the quiet young woman who had just outshot most of them. Not bad for someone who looks like she belongs in a library instead of a battlefield, one recruit muttered to his buddy. Sarah pretended not to hear, but she filed the comment away. She had been hearing variations of it her entire life, and she knew this qualification was just the beginning. The real tests were yet to come. Later that afternoon, Williams called Sarah aside as the group prepared for evening chow. His expression was unreadable as he looked down at his clipboard, then back at her. "Chun, your scores today were in the top 10% of all recruits I've trained," he said simply. "But scores on a range are just numbers. The question is whether you can perform when lives are on the line." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I understand, Sergeant. I'm ready for whatever comes next." Williams nodded slowly. "We'll see. Tomorrow we start advanced training. Long-range shots, moving targets, and stress scenarios. The real work begins now." As Sarah walked toward the mess hall, she couldn't help but think about her father's words from years ago when he first taught her to shoot. "Anyone can hit a target when everything is perfect," he had said. "A real marksman hits the target when everything is going wrong." She had a feeling that tomorrow she would get her first real chance to prove whether she was truly a marksman or just someone who could shoot well under ideal conditions. The thought should have made her nervous, but instead it filled her with anticipation. She had spent her whole life preparing for challenges that others thought she couldn't handle. The next phase of training would be different from anything she had experienced so far, but Sarah was ready. She had to be ready because somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew that eventually these skills would be tested in a situation where missing the target wouldn't just mean failing a test. It would mean people died. As she entered the mess hall and grabbed a tray, Sarah could still feel the eyes of her fellow recruits on her. Some looked at her with new respect, others with continued skepticism. All of them were wondering the same thing, whether the small, quiet woman who had just outshot most of them could handle what was coming next. Sarah had been wondering the same thing herself, but she was determined to find out. Her journey to become a military sniper was just beginning, and she knew that the real test would push her far beyond anything she had faced in basic qualification. She was ready to meet those challenges head-on, no matter what they threw at her. 3 months later, Sarah found herself lying in the mud at 400 hours, rain soaking through her ghillie suit as she peered through her scope at a target nearly 1,200 yards away. Advanced sniper training had proven to be everything Sergeant Williams had promised, and more. The comfortable shooting ranges had been replaced by realistic combat scenarios, sleep deprivation, and conditions that would have sent her home crying during her first week of basic training. "Chun, what's your wind reading?" Williams whispered into his radio. He was positioned 200 yards behind her, observing through binoculars as she prepared for what would be her final qualification shot of the advanced course. "Wind is variable, Sergeant. Approximately 12 miles per hour from the northwest, gusting to 15, Sarah replied quietly into her throat mic. "I'm reading some thermal layering at about the 800-yard mark that's going to affect bullet trajectory." Williams made a note on his waterproof clipboard. In 3 months of training, Sarah had developed an almost uncanny ability to read environmental conditions that affected long-range shooting. While other recruits struggled with wind calls and range estimation, she seemed to instinctively understand how air density, temperature gradients, and even humidity would affect her shots. The target she was aiming at was not the simple paper bullseye from basic qualification. Instead, It was a human-shaped steel silhouette positioned behind partial cover, simulating a real combat scenario where only a small portion of an enemy would be visible. To make matters more challenging, she had been awake for 36 hours straight as part of the sleep deprivation testing that was standard for advanced sniper training. Sarah controlled her breathing and began her firing sequence. Through her scope, she could see the heat waves rising from several different areas between her position and the target. Each layer of air at a different temperature would bend her bullet's path slightly, requiring calculations that most people couldn't make under ideal conditions, let alone while exhausted and lying in mud. She squeezed the trigger with the same smooth motion that had become second nature over the past months. The bullet left her rifle with a sharp crack that echoed across the training area. Through her scope, she watched the steel target swing backward as the bullet struck exactly where she had aimed center mass on the visible portion of the silhouette. Target hit, confirmed kill shot, Williams reported into his radio. Chun, pack up your gear. Training exercise complete. As Sarah began breaking down her rifle, she reflected on how much had changed since that first day on the basic qualification range. She had not only passed every phase of advanced training, but had consistently scored among the top performers in her class. More importantly, she had gained the respect of both her instructors and fellow recruits through months of proving herself under increasingly difficult conditions. The other members of her training class had gradually stopped questioning whether she belonged there. Rodriguez, who had been her harshest critic during basic training, now regularly sought her advice on reading wind conditions and making long-range calculations. Even the instructors had begun treating her differently, giving her the same level of respect they showed to recruits who came from elite military backgrounds. But Sarah knew that all the training in the world couldn't truly prepare someone for actual combat conditions. Everything they had done so far, no matter how realistic, was still just training. The targets didn't shoot back, and missing a shot meant repeating the exercise, not watching someone die. That afternoon, as the training class gathered for their final briefing, Williams stood before them with an expression that was more serious than usual. The 12 recruits who had started the advanced course had been reduced to 8 through the grueling selection process. Those who remained represented some of the most skilled marksmen the military had ever produced. Ladies and gentlemen, you have completed one of the most challenging training programs in the United States military, Williams began. Your skills with a rifle are now among the best in the world. But I want to be very clear about something. Everything you've learned here is just preparation for the real thing. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Within the next 6 months, most of you will find yourselves deployed to combat zones where the skills you have learned here will mean the difference between life and death. Not just your own lives, but the lives of the soldiers who depend on you to provide overwatch and eliminate threats they can't handle themselves. Sarah listened carefully as Williams went on to describe the types of missions they might face as qualified snipers. Counterinsurgency operations where they would have to identify and eliminate specific high-value targets. Urban warfare scenarios where precise shots would be needed to avoid civilian casualties. Long-range reconnaissance missions where they would be alone behind enemy lines for days or weeks at a time. The shot you took this morning, Chun, Williams said, looking directly at her, was from 1,200 yards under challenging conditions. That's impressive by any standard. But in 6 months, you might find yourself taking a shot at twice that distance with the lives of an entire unit, depending on your accuracy. After the briefing, Sarah walked alone toward the barracks, her mind racing with thoughts about what lay ahead. She had joined the military partly to prove to herself that she could handle whatever challenges came her way, but also because she genuinely wanted to serve her country and protect others who couldn't protect themselves. That evening, she called her parents from the base phone center. Her father, a former police officer who had taught her to shoot as a child, was proud of her accomplishments but worried about her upcoming deployment. "I know you're one of the best shots I've ever seen," he told her over the crackling phone connection. "But being a good shot and being a good soldier are two different things. Make sure you remember that the most important shot you'll ever take is the one that brings you home safe." Her mother was more direct in her concerns. "Sarah, I've been reading about what snipers do in combat zones. Are you sure this is what you want? It's not too late to request a transfer to a different specialty." Sarah understood her parents' concerns, but she also knew that she had found her calling. The combination of technical skill, mental discipline, and physical endurance required for precision marksmanship suited her perfectly. More importantly, she believed that her abilities could make a real difference in protecting other soldiers and completing vital missions. "Mom, I know you're worried," Sarah said gently, "but this is something I need to do. I have skills that can help save lives and complete missions that other people can't handle. I can't walk away from that responsibility." Over the following weeks, as Sarah waited for her deployment orders, she continued training on her own time. She practiced shooting at longer ranges, studied weather patterns and ballistics tables, and maintained the physical conditioning that would be essential for survival in a combat environment. She also spent time talking with soldiers who had returned from recent deployments. Their stories gave her a realistic perspective on what she might face. They talked about the loneliness of spending days in hiding, watching for targets. They described the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between completing a mission and causing a disaster. Most importantly, they emphasized the weight of responsibility that came with being the person others counted on when everything went wrong. When her orders finally came, Sarah learned that she would be deploying to Afghanistan as part of a special operations unit. Her mission would involve providing precision fire support for infantry operations and conducting reconnaissance missions in areas too dangerous for larger units to operate. As she packed her gear for deployment, Sarah found herself thinking about that first day of basic sniper training when Rodriguez had questioned whether she could even lift her rifle. Now, that same rifle was about to become her primary tool for keeping other soldiers alive in one of the world's most dangerous combat zones. She had proven herself capable during training, but she knew that combat would test her in ways that no training exercise could replicate. Soon, she would discover whether all her preparation had truly made her ready for the ultimate test of a sniper's skill, making shots that mattered when failure was not an option. The Afghan sun was merciless as it beat down on Sarah's position among the rocks overlooking the Kunar Valley. She had been deployed for 3 months now, and the harsh reality of combat operations had quickly replaced any romantic notions about military service she might have harbored. This was her 43rd mission as part of Alpha Team, a special operations unit tasked with providing overwatch for infantry patrols in one of Afghanistan's most dangerous provinces. Through her scope, Sarah watched a patrol of 8 American soldiers making their way through the village below. Intelligence reports suggested that insurgents were planning an ambush somewhere along the patrol route, but the exact location remained unknown. Sarah's job was to provide precision fire support if the patrol ran into trouble they couldn't handle on their own. "Overwatch, this is Alpha 16, came the voice of Lieutenant Mason through her radio headset. "We're approaching the marketplace. Any movement on your end?" Sarah swept her scope across the surrounding buildings, looking for any sign of hostile activity. At 1,800 yards from her hide position, she could see everything happening in the village with crystal clarity through her high-powered optics. So far, everything looked normal. Civilians going about their daily business, children playing in the streets, merchants hawking their wares. Alpha 16, Overwatch. Negative on hostile movement. Civilian traffic appears normal, Sarah replied quietly into her throat mic. Her spotter, Corporal Jake Thompson, lay beside her with binoculars, providing a second set of eyes on the developing situation. Thompson was a veteran of 2 previous deployments and had initially been skeptical about working with a female sniper. 3 months of successful missions had changed his attitude completely. He had never worked with anyone who could read terrain and make accurate distance calculations as quickly as Sarah could. "Movement, 2 o'clock, Thompson whispered, pointing toward a building approximately 400 yards from the patrol's position. "Second floor window, looks like someone with optics." Sarah swung her scope toward the indicated building and immediately spotted what Thompson had seen. A man with binoculars was watching the American patrol from a concealed position. By itself, this might not mean anything. Curious civilians often watched military patrols, but something about the man's positioning and behavior raised red flags. "I see him," Sarah confirmed. "He's tracking the patrol movement. Stand by for assessment." She watched the man through her scope for 30 seconds, noting how he carefully stayed hidden from the patrol while maintaining visual contact with them. His positioning suggested military training, and the way he occasionally spoke into what appeared to be a radio confirmed her suspicions. Alpha 1-6, Overwatch. I have a possible spotter in building complex 400 yards northeast of your position. Second floor, northwest window. Individual appears to be conducting surveillance and reporting your movements. Copy, Overwatch. Can you take the shot if needed? Mason's voice carried the tension of a leader who knew his men might be walking into an ambush. Sarah calculated the range to the target, approximately 2,200 yards, well within her capability, but challenging due to the urban environment and potential for civilian casualties. The wind was relatively calm, but she would need to account for the bullet's trajectory over buildings and the heat distortion rising from the sun-baked streets. Affirmative, Alpha 1-6. I have a clear shot if required. However, I cannot confirm hostile intent at this time. This was one of the most difficult aspects of combat operations that Sarah had discovered since her deployment. In training, targets were clearly defined as hostile. In real combat, especially in populated areas, determining who was a legitimate threat required split-second decisions with incomplete information. The patrol continued moving through the village, but Sarah kept her scope trained on the suspicious individual. Through her optics, she could see him making what appeared to be radio calls every time the patrol changed direction. Her finger moved to rest lightly on her trigger, ready to take the shot if the situation escalated. Overwatch, we have movement in the buildings to our south, came another voice over the radio, Sergeant Williams from the patrol. Looks like armed individuals taking positions. Sarah immediately began scanning the buildings south of the patrol position. Within seconds, she spotted what Williams had seen. 3 men with AK-47 rifles moving into ambush positions overlooking the route the patrol would need to take to return to base. Confirmed hostile movement, Sarah reported. 3 individuals with rifles, approximately 1,900 yards from my position. They're setting up an ambush. Overwatch, you are cleared to engage. Mason's voice was sharp with urgency. Take them out. This was what Sarah had trained for. A clear tactical situation where her long-range precision could save American lives. She quickly calculated the range and conditions for her first target, a man who was positioning himself behind a low wall with a clear line of sight on the patrol route. Sarah controlled her breathing and began her firing sequence. The rifle bucked against her shoulder as the bullet left the barrel. Through her scope, she watched the man drop behind the wall, her shot having found its mark. Without pausing, she worked the bolt action and acquired her second target. The second insurgent was partially concealed behind a doorway, presenting only a small target area. At nearly 2,000 yards, this was among the most challenging shots Sarah had attempted in combat. She made minute adjustments to account for the slight crosswind and elevated angle, then squeezed the trigger. The second target also dropped from sight. Sarah immediately moved to acquire the third target, but he had apparently seen his companions fall and was attempting to flee the area. She led him slightly with her crosshairs and fired her third shot. The man stumbled and fell, neutralized before he could escape or return fire on the patrol. Overwatch, that's 3 targets down, Thompson reported into his radio. Threat eliminated. Outstanding work, Overwatch, came Mason's relieved voice. You just saved our lives down here. But Sarah wasn't finished. She swung her scope back toward the original building where she had spotted the spotter. The man was still there, and now he was frantically talking in his radio while looking in her general direction. He had apparently figured out where the sniper fire was coming from. I still have the original spotter, Sarah reported. He's calling in our position. Even as she spoke, She could see the man pointing in her direction while speaking into his radio. Within minutes, her hide position would likely be compromised, and enemy forces would be moving to eliminate her and Thompson. "Take the shot," Thompson urged. "He's definitely hostile now." Sarah lined up the crosshairs on the spotter. At 2,200 yards, this would be the longest combat shot she had ever attempted. The man was partially concealed, presenting only his head and upper torso as a target. A miss would confirm their exact location to enemy forces throughout the area. She went through her mental checklist one final time. Wind speed and direction, range calculation, bullet draw compensation, and breathing control. When everything felt perfect, she squeezed the trigger with the same smooth motion she had practiced thousands of times. The bullet traveled for nearly 3 seconds before impact. Through her scope, Sarah watched the spotter drop from view, her fourth successful engagement of the day. The immediate threat to the patrol had been eliminated, but she knew that enemy forces in the area now knew approximately where her team was located. "We need to relocate immediately," Thompson said, already beginning to pack up their equipment. "Every insurgent within 10 miles is going to be looking for us." Sarah quickly broke down her rifle and gathered her gear. As they prepared to move to their backup hide position, she felt a mixture of satisfaction and soberness about what had just happened. Her training had proven effective when it mattered most. She had successfully eliminated multiple targets at extreme range and saved the lives of 8 American soldiers. But she also understood that this engagement would have consequences. Word would spread throughout the insurgent networks that there was an American sniper operating in this area with exceptional long-range capabilities. Future missions would be more dangerous as enemy forces adapted their tactics to counter this new threat. As Sarah and Thompson moved carefully through the rocky terrain toward their extraction point, she reflected on how much her role had evolved since deployment. She was no longer just a soldier with exceptional marksmanship skills. She had become a strategic asset whose presence could influence enemy behavior throughout an entire region. The patrol made it safely back to base, and Sarah's successful engagement became the subject of briefings at higher command levels. Word of the female sniper, who could eliminate targets at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, began to spread throughout military intelligence circles. But Sarah knew that her growing reputation would also make her a high-value target for enemy forces. Each successful mission increased both her value to American operations and the danger she faced from insurgents determined to eliminate the sniper who had become a significant threat to their activities. The war was far from over, and Sarah was beginning to understand that her greatest challenges still lay ahead. 6 months into her deployment, Sarah had developed a reputation that extended far beyond her immediate unit. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgent groups had placed a substantial bounty on the Ghost Sniper, their name for the American marksman who seemed capable of hitting targets at impossible distances. What they didn't know was that their most feared enemy was a 24-year-old woman from Colorado who had grown up hunting elk in the Rocky Mountains. The mission briefing on October 15th was unlike anything Sarah had received before. Major Collins, the unit's commanding officer, stood before a room filled with his most experienced operators, his expression grave as he outlined the situation they were about to face. Intelligence indicates that a high-value target will be meeting with local insurgent leaders in a compound approximately 15 miles from our current position. Collins began, pointing to a satellite photograph on the wall. This individual is responsible for coordinating attacks that have killed over 30 American soldiers in the past 6 months. Sarah studied the photograph carefully. The compound was situated in a valley surrounded by steep hills, with only one practical approach route. It was the type of location that insurgents chose specifically because it was difficult for conventional forces to assault without sustaining heavy casualties. The problem, Collins continued, is that the compound is heavily defended, and we have intelligence suggesting that they're holding American prisoners inside. A direct assault could result in the execution of those prisoners before we could reach them. Thompson, who had become Sarah's permanent spotter after their successful partnership, raised his hand. "What's the proposed solution, sir?" Collins turned towards Sarah. We need someone who can eliminate the high-value target from extreme range before he has a chance to order the execution of the prisoners. The shot would need to be taken from approximately 3,200 yards away, the only position that provides line of sight to the compound while remaining outside their defensive perimeter. Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly as she processed the implications. A shot at 3,200 yards, nearly 2 miles, was at the absolute limit of what was considered possible with their equipment. She had never attempted anything beyond 2,500 yards, even in training. At that distance, factors like the Earth's rotation would begin to affect bullet trajectory. "Ma'am," Collins said, looking directly at her, "you're the only sniper in theater with the demonstrated capability to even attempt this shot. But I want you to understand, if you miss, those prisoners will likely be executed, and our assault team will walk into a prepared defensive position." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "What's the timeline, sir?" "The meeting is scheduled for tomorrow at 1,400 hours. You would need to be in position by dawn to have time for proper range calculation and environmental assessment." That evening, Sarah spent hours studying topographical maps and satellite imagery of the target area. The shooting position would be on a ridgeline that provided a clear line of sight to the compound, but also left her and Thompson completely exposed if enemy forces managed to locate them. Thompson found her in the intelligence tent after midnight, still poring over the maps and ballistics calculations. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Collins would understand if you said the shot was beyond reasonable possibility." Sarah looked up from her calculations. "Those soldiers are counting on someone to get them out. If I don't take this shot, who else is going to?" "But 3,200 yards. Thompson shook his head. "That's not just shooting. That's like trying to hit a specific playing card from 2 miles away. And that's assuming perfect conditions." "I've been thinking about it," Sarah said, showing him her calculations. "The elevation advantage will help with bullet drop, and weather reports show minimal wind for tomorrow afternoon. The shot is possible, but it's going to require everything I've learned." They spent the rest of the night going over every detail of the mission plan. Sarah calculated bullet trajectories, estimated time of flight, nearly 4 seconds for the bullet to reach its target, and studied photographs of the compound to identify exactly where the high-value target would likely position himself during the meeting. At 0400 hours, Sarah and Thompson began their movement toward the shooting position. They carried equipment for a 3-day mission, including backup rifles, additional ammunition, and survival gear in case extraction was delayed. The weight of the gear made the 12-mile trek through mountainous terrain particularly challenging, but they maintained the pace necessary to reach the shooting position before dawn. The ridgeline overlooking the target compound was everything the maps had suggested, a perfect shooting position with an unobstructed view, but completely exposed to observation from multiple directions. They spent 2 hours carefully constructing a hide position using natural materials and camouflage netting. By 0800 hours, Sarah had her rifle setup complete and was beginning the long process of range calculation and environmental assessment. At 3,200 yards, even minor errors in distance estimation or wind reading would result in a complete miss. Range confirmed at 3,187 yards. Thompson reported after spending an hour with a laser rangefinder, taking measurements from multiple angles to ensure accuracy. Sarah made careful adjustments to her scope, accounting for the extreme distance and elevation difference. The compound was nearly 800 feet below their position, which would affect bullet trajectory in ways that required precise calculation. Throughout the morning, they observed activity in the compound through high-powered optics. Sarah could see guards moving between buildings, but no sign of the prisoners or the high-value target who was supposed to arrive for the afternoon meeting. At 1,330 hours, a convoy of vehicles approached the compound from the south. Through her scope, Sarah watched as several men emerged from the vehicles and entered the main building. One of them matched the description of their target, a tall man with a distinctive beard wearing traditional Afghan clothing. "I have positive identification," Sarah reported into her radio. "Target has entered the compound and is moving toward the main building. Copy, Overwatch, came Colin's voice. Assault teams are standing by. You are cleared to engage when you have a clear shot. Sarah settled into her final shooting position and began her pre-shot routine. At this distance, the bullet would take almost 4 seconds to reach its target, requiring her to account for any movement the target might make during that time. Through her scope, she could see the main building where the meeting was taking place. Several windows provided potential shooting opportunities, but she would need to wait for the target to position himself in a location where she could guarantee a clear shot. At 1,347 hours, the target appeared at a window on the second floor of the main building. He was standing in profile, apparently looking out over the compound while talking to someone inside the room. Sarah could see him clearly through her scope, a perfect target silhouette. "I have the shot," she reported quietly. Sarah went through her final checklist. Wind was calm, direction confirmed, range verified at 3,187 yards. Bullet drop compensation calculated for the extreme distance and elevation advantage. Time of flight estimated at 3.8 seconds based on muzzle velocity and ballistic coefficients. She controlled her breathing and placed the crosshairs exactly where her calculations indicated they needed to be, several feet above and slightly to the right of the target to account for bullet drop and drift at the extreme range. The moment felt surreal as Sarah squeezed the trigger. The rifle's recoil was familiar, but knowing that the bullet would take nearly 4 seconds to reach its target created an odd sense of disconnection. Through her scope, she watched the target continuing to stand at the window, completely unaware that a bullet was racing toward him at over 2,500 feet per second. 3 seconds passed. 4 seconds. At 3.8 seconds after she fired, Sarah saw the target suddenly drop from view. Through her scope, she could see that the window frame where he had been standing showed clear signs of bullet impact. "Target down," Thompson reported into his radio. "Confirmed hit at 3,187 yards. Within minutes, the assault teams began their approach to the compound. With the high-value target eliminated and the element of surprise maintained, they were able to breach the defensive perimeter and rescue 3 American prisoners before the remaining insurgents could organize effective resistance. As Sarah and Thompson packed up their gear for extraction, she reflected on what had just happened. She had successfully made the longest combat shot in her career, possibly one of the longest confirmed kills in military history. More importantly, her shot had saved the lives of 3 American prisoners and enabled the successful completion of a critical mission. But even as she felt satisfaction in the mission's success, Sarah knew that this shot would further enhance her reputation among both American forces and enemy combatants. The insurgents now knew that nowhere within a 2-mile radius was safe from the mysterious sniper they called the Ghost. The war was entering a new phase for Sarah, one where her growing legend would make her both an invaluable asset and a primary target for enemy forces determined to eliminate the sniper who had become their greatest threat. The intelligence briefing that would change everything came on a gray November morning, 8 months into Sarah's deployment. Major Collins stood before the assembled Special Operations team with a satellite photograph that showed a scene none of them had expected to see, a large-scale coordinated attack being planned against Forward Operating Base Chapman, where over 400 American soldiers were stationed. "We have confirmed intelligence that insurgent forces are planning a major assault on Chapman in 48 hours, Collins began, his voice carrying the weight of the situation. They've managed to coordinate multiple cells and have positioned heavy weapons on the ridgelines overlooking the base." Sarah studied the photographs as Collins continued his briefing. The insurgents had chosen their positions well. Multiple gun emplacements scattered across a mountain ridge approximately 4,800 yards from the main base. The distance put them well outside the range of most defensive weapons while giving them overlapping fields of fire that would turn the base into a killing zone. "The problem," Collins continued, "is that these positions are too far away for our artillery to reach effectively, and close air support is limited due to weather conditions moving into the area. We need someone who can eliminate these gun emplacements before they can begin their bombardment. Thompson, sitting beside Sarah, leaned over and whispered, "Please tell me he's not thinking what I think he's thinking." Collins turned towards Sarah. "Chun, I know what I'm about to ask seems impossible. The farthest gun emplacement is at 4,847 yards, nearly 3 miles. That's beyond anything we've attempted before." Sarah felt the familiar calm settling over her as she processed the tactical situation. Nearly 3 miles was indeed beyond anything she had ever attempted, beyond what most people would consider possible with conventional sniper equipment. But those 400 soldiers at Chapman didn't have any other options. "What's the timeline?" she asked. "You would need to be in position by 0600 hours tomorrow to have enough daylight to identify and engage all 5 gun positions before they begin their assault at sunset." That evening, Sarah worked alone in the equipment tent, modifying her rifle and ammunition for the longest shots she had ever attempted. At nearly 3 miles, she would be pushing her equipment beyond its design capabilities. She carefully selected her ammunition, choosing rounds with the highest muzzle velocity and best ballistic coefficients available. Thompson found her making final adjustments to her scope. "Sarah, I've been doing calculations all day. Even if everything goes perfectly, no wind, perfect visibility, exact range measurements, a shot at that distance is more luck than skill." "I know," Sarah replied, without looking up from her scope adjustments. "But those soldiers don't care about the odds. They need someone to try, and I'm the only one who has any chance of making these shots. What if we're wrong about the range? What if the weather changes? What if your equipment malfunctions?" Sarah finally looked up at him. "Then 400 American soldiers die tomorrow night. But if I don't try, they die anyway." They spent the night planning every detail of the mission. Sarah would need to engage 5 separate targets spread across a 2-mile stretch of ridgeline, each requiring different calculations for range, elevation, and environmental conditions. After eliminating each target, she would need to relocate to avoid counter-battery fire from other positions. At 0200 hours, Sarah and Thompson began their movement toward the shooting position. The 12-mile approach march through mountainous terrain in complete darkness was one of the most challenging physical tests either of them had faced. They carried additional ammunition, backup equipment, and enough supplies to remain in position for up to 3 days if extraction was delayed. By 0530 hours, they were in position on a ridgeline that provided line of sight to all 5 enemy gun emplacements. Sarah began the painstaking process of calculating ranges and environmental conditions for each target. At distances approaching 3 miles, factors like air density, temperature layering, and even the Earth's rotation would affect bullet trajectory. Target 1 confirmed at 4,284 yards. Thompson reported after spending an hour with a laser rangefinder. Target 2 at 4,556 yards. Target 3 at 4,729 yards. Target 4 at 4,683 yards. Target 5 at 4,847 yards. Sarah made careful notes of each range, along with the elevation differences and environmental conditions that would affect each shot. The longest target, nearly 3 miles away, would require bullet draw compensation of over 1,200 inches and would be affected by wind drift even in minimal wind conditions. Throughout the morning, they observed enemy activity through high-powered optics. Sarah could see insurgents moving equipment into the gun positions, setting up what appeared to be heavy machine guns and possibly mortars. The assault on Chapman was clearly being planned as a major operation. At 1,400 hours, Major Collins' voice came over their radio. "Overwatch, we're receiving reports that the enemy assault may begin earlier than expected. You are cleared to engage at your discretion." Sarah settled into position behind her rifle and began engaging the closest target first. At 4,284 yards, Target 1 was still an extremely long shot, but within the range she had previously demonstrated. She went through her complete firing sequence, accounting for all environmental factors, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet flight time at that distance was over 5 seconds. Through her scope, Sarah watched as the insurgent operating the gun position suddenly dropped from view. Her first shot had found its mark. Target 1 neutralized, Thompson reported. Moving to target 2. Without pause, Sarah adjusted her position and began calculating the shot to target 2 at 4,556 yards. This distance was beyond anything she had attempted in combat, requiring calculations that pushed the limits of her equipment's capabilities. The shot required elevation adjustments that used nearly all the available travel in her scope. She fired her second shot and waited through the long seconds as the bullet traveled toward its target. At 5.2 seconds after firing, she saw the second gun position go silent as her bullet found its target. Target 2 down, Thompson confirmed. 3 targets remaining. Sarah quickly relocated to a position that provided better angles for the remaining targets. Target 3, at 4,729 yards, required her to account for a significant crosswind that had developed as the afternoon progressed. She made careful calculations for wind drift and fired her third shot. The bullet took 5.4 seconds to reach its target. Through her scope, Sarah saw the insurgent manning the position suddenly collapse, her shot having traveled nearly 2.7 miles to find its mark. Target 3 eliminated, Thompson reported. 2 targets left. Target 4 presented a partially concealed position that offered only a small target area. At 4,683 yards, Sarah would need to thread her bullet through a gap in the rocks that provided only a few inches of clearance. She took extra time calculating the precise aiming point needed to account for the extreme range and partial concealment. Her fourth shot was successful, eliminating the threat at nearly 2.7 miles distance. Target 4 down, Thompson confirmed. 1 target remaining. Target 5, the farthest shot at 4,847 yards, represented the ultimate test of Sarah's capabilities. At nearly 3 miles, this shot would push beyond what most ballistics experts considered possible with conventional sniper equipment. The bullet would travel for nearly 6 seconds and would be affected by wind drift, air density changes, and gravitational effects that required calculations she had never attempted in combat. Sarah took 15 minutes to verify her calculations and ensure that every factor was properly accounted for. Wind speed and direction, temperature gradients, humidity levels, and even the slight rotation of the Earth during the bullet's flight time all had to be considered. When she was satisfied with her calculations, Sarah settled into her final shooting position. Through her scope, she could see the insurgent at target 5 positioning his weapon to begin the assault on Chapman. This would be the shot that would either save 400 American soldiers or fail and leave them defenseless against the coordinated attack. She controlled her breathing, placed her crosshairs according to her calculations, and squeezed the trigger with the same smooth motion she had practiced thousands of times. The bullet left her rifle and began its journey across nearly 3 miles of Afghan mountainside. Sarah watched through her scope as seconds ticked by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. At 5.8 seconds after she fired, she saw the distant figure at target 5 suddenly drop from sight. Target 5 down, Thompson reported, his voice filled with amazement. All 5 gun positions eliminated. Sarah had successfully engaged 5 targets at ranges between 4,284 and 4,847 yards, the longest confirmed combat shots in military history. More importantly, her shooting had eliminated the threat to forward operating base Chapman and saved the lives of 400 American soldiers. As they prepared for extraction, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From that first day of basic sniper training, when recruits doubted whether she could even lift her rifle, to making shots at distances that military experts would have considered impossible just years earlier. The radio crackled with Colin's voice. "Outstanding work, Overwatch. Chapman is secure, and intel indicates the insurgent assault has been called off. You just prevented what could have been the largest loss of American life in this theater." Sarah's reputation as the ghost sniper was now based on documented achievements that would be studied by military marksmen for generations. But more importantly to her, she had proven that dedication, skill, and determination could overcome any obstacle, even the doubts of those who initially questioned whether she belonged on a battlefield. The war would continue, and there would be other missions, other challenges. But Sarah Chun had established herself as one of the most capable precision marksmen in military history, and had saved hundreds of lives through her exceptional skill and unwavering courage under pressure. She had answered definitively the question that had followed her since basic training, whether she could perform when everything was on the line. The answer, demonstrated across nearly 3 miles of Afghan mountains, was a resounding yes.